And at the heart of all of these conversations, when we're talking about what needs to change, it's always framed around the culture, right? The police culture, and the makeup of our police departments. One of our questions came in from Trinity of Weymouth, and she says that she believes that super aggressive training tactics are at the root of police shootings. So I guess, let's go back to kind of who's in charge of the training. Who is carrying out the training in these areas on helping officers understand how they should deal with people in minority communities? Who's behind that?
Let me just quickly add one more thing about
Sure.
the union makeup that I think helps us with this next piece of this conversation, which is that, the unions are made up of individual employees of the police departments. So one of the things that we're not discussing yet is as we diversify and alter the makeup of what our law enforcement agencies look like, then we inherently create the opportunity to change the makeup of what our police unions look like. That takes time. That takes a lot of intentional effort to diversify departments, but that's something that can make a difference in the makeup and the ability to have a conversation about what the new sort of landscape of law enforcement should look like or public safety should look like in any community.
Right. And to the question of training, who's involved in the training? Are these outside groups that are brought in to help the police officers, or is it internally within a police department?
Well, there are two ways to look at it. I think police departments want to internalize and analyze their own use of force policies and kind of de-escalation strategies. Though they want to say that's part of the conversation, it is. But you also have a system that's taking it's militarizing its force and its equipment. And there's a question of whether you can do both at the same time. And so I think there are different ways to look at the training and the policies that are being handled out. There's community level training and conversations that do happen, but there's also concerns of militarization and of departments that aren't necessarily at one with that community standard at the same time.
Can you talk a little bit more about what you mean, when the militarization of the police department?
Yes, when we see some of the protests and the riots and officers, there was concern. We just saw this in June where some councilors raised concerns that police would be arriving at some of these protests and rallies armed with full military style equipment. We're talking batons, we're talking shields, we're talking Humvees and almost military like equipment, some military style rifles as well. And there's a question of whether those belong in a community policing agency.
Okay. And Sophia, you brought it up, you touched on it a while ago about the need for diversity within the unions. What about the police departments themselves? We've heard from people who said we need to have more people who look like the people that the police officers are supposed to be protecting, right? We heard that from one person who sent in this response.
I think a lot of the police officers maybe are from outside of the community and they don't actually can relate to the young people in the community. So it would be nice to have someone from the community be part of it.
The recruitment process has to be more legitimate. I feel as though they kind of allow, not any and everybody, but to a certain extent, any and everybody to join the police force. I feel as though more background checks and more past history as far as mental illness, as far as their family's mental illness and things like that.
I think that they have to be reflective and figure out why does this keep happening?
So, Sophia, let's talk about this a little bit more about, diversity within police departments. One of the things that struck me is that you'll see these videos of an incident that happens in some community somewhere in the United States. And in the video, it might be a white police officer trying to arrest an African-American male. There may be some violence that plays out. But you'll see in the background there is an officer of color, or even an officer of color is involved in the situation as well. Is diversity alone in the police department the answer?
So let me say, first and foremost, I think it's definitely part of the conversation. I do not think that we can break down the inherent distrust that exists between Black and Brown communities and law enforcement without having more law enforcement reflect those communities that they police. It is no question that there is more of a law enforcement presence in Black and Brown communities than white communities. And if they are going to flood those communities, some of them need to be from there. They need to have the ability to engage and communicate with the people that they are serving. Now, you're right, though. Diversity alone is not enough. It won't abolish misconduct. It won't abolish lawsuits. I'll still have a job, unfortunately. But it will get to the accountability piece. And I believe that we can't have this conversation about police misconduct without talking about police accountability. If we don't have equitable systems that look fair from beginning to end, and that also means having fair systems that seek to hire a actual reflective community group, they have to be in communities recruiting. They have to have fair systems when they're hiring. They have to care about what the messaging they're sending with who they promote. All of that goes to the accountability. If everything is done behind closed doors and none of it ever looks like the community that you're trying to get buy-in from, then there will absolutely never be any believed accountability from that community. So diversity plays a role in all of that. We really can't remove the notion of race and identity from this conversation of having equitable police enforcement.
And Milton, I'm wondering if what plays out sometimes in these situations, so you might have a couple of officers of color who are sort of standing by and watching a situation unfold, and there is this fear of stepping in because, again, it's this culture within a police department, and or there's this fear of, oh, if I say anything, if I try to stop this, then what are my other police officers going to think about me? Are they going to be watching my back? Is that playing out as well in situations like this?
Yeah, we saw that in Minneapolis, didn't we? Where there was an officer who was new to the job, and his storyline when he became the police officer was, I want to come into this department so I can bring about change and affect change. And he was one of the officers who stood by. So there's a real question. Officers today, in interviews later, an officer would say we have the responsibility. And there are obviously there are laws. I think Dallas was a leader in kind of creating policy that you have an obligation and a duty to report. But that shouldn't need to be made in policy and ordinance and law. It should be part of the culture of the department. And unfortunately, it's had that adverse effect where you're part of the department, part of that culture, and there is a unwillingness or reluctance to take that next step. And we saw that in Minneapolis right there.
I want to play another clip from our interview with Cheryl Dorsey. She's the retired LAPD sergeant. She talks about something she witnessed in her 20 years on the force in California.
You said something that caught my attention. It was you were referring to officers and how they handle themselves in protest. And I think you talked about almost as if they have this glee that they get to go out and have, quote, a little stick time. Yeah. Can you talk to me about that? What that is that one of those urban legend things, or this is really how they view this opportunity to go and keep the peace when there's protest?
Some do, and yeah, no, it's a thing. And I hear things, cops talk, in roll call. Some brag about, what is about to go down. They're looking forward to it as we're all suiting up and putting on our gear and getting our helmets and our face shields, because ordinarily when an officer is involved in a use of force, there's paperwork. We've got to request a supervisor. Supervisor's got to do an investigation. They've got to interview us. They interview the person who was assaulted to find out if it was justified. And so in a protest, in the midst of all that mayhem and chaos, it's stick time. It's party hats for everybody. And we know that that's true because you've seen videos of officers celebrating, being able to fire rubber bullets at somebody and not have to explain why they fired as many as they did, in the way that they did. And so, yeah, it's a thing. And there are officers who live for that.